What I would like to do by way of a PowerPoint presentation is to look carefully at how in the Indigenous community we might perceive the experience of mission, and to talk about it from the standpoint of deficit versus asset-based experience in an intercultural approach to mission. And hopefully this will make some sense. So let me first say welcome to you, and welcome to this part of the globe, Mi'kma'ki, which is the land of Mi'kmaq people. And I welcome you here, though not person to person, at the very least pixel to pixel, as we have been doing over these past 18 months, many of us. This is the land from which I speak to you, the land more particularly known as Prince Edward Island in English, pedagogy, the land cradled in the waves, which is one of 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki. I speak to you out of the context of a family, 3 children and a wife of nearly 50 years, who support this work and have supported me completely and consistently down through the years. Our daughters, who each are doing PhD research at 2 institutions in Canada, our son Matt, who has just returned from a rather arduous experience of mission overseas and just landed in Canada yesterday. And we're grateful to have him back home with us. I also greet you on behalf of our chief, Kichisagamau Junior Gould, and the council in our community here, as well as Darlene Bernard, chief of the other First Nation community on the island at Lennox Island. I'm talking about assets, deficits, and interculturality, and talking about it as a framework for change. And I acknowledge at the outset that much of what I present you will be familiar with. You will have reviewed or researched or read about, or perhaps discussed in a variety of other contexts. But I expect that some of this will be constructed or put together in a way that might be different than you have experienced. And hopefully that itself creates a fulcrum for some learning for each of us. So we begin with the Jerusalem Council and Acts 15, where there's a clear articulation of a resistance to the colonial impulse to assimilate. In other words, the believers of the sect of the Pharisees, who brought a requirement to bear that Gentiles must first become Jewish before they could become followers of Jesus, were resisted by the Jerusalem Council, and a clear mandate was established that said that we lay upon you no greater burden than 4 essentials. And so there was a clear expectation in my read of this text that there is no singular cultural frame into which we must find ourselves entering when we come to faith in Jesus Christ by way of hearing the gospel. It is this articulation that resisted the impulse to assimilate people from other cultures and ethne into a singular expression of Christianity that is foundational, in my view, to an appropriate mission expression. It is here where we see interculturality, as it were, being expressed, since the Gentiles came from a variety of ethne and cultural expressions and languages. Post-Jerusalem Council, from AD 100 and following, we find that the church begins to succumb to the colonial impulse. We find that the now new statement is, you must become as we are in order that. And so here, where the Gentiles were affirmed that they need not become Jews, the Gentiles now affirm that Jews must be setting aside Judaism. And we see the emergence of a expressed anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism is further expressed as an anti-culturalism, as it were, as the mission moves forward. And we can see that in such writings as Michael Cook, William Nichols, Robert Miller, and then Craig Evans. Then we find further the Christian acceptance of the idea of this monolithic expression of Christianity from 313 through to 692 with the Constantinian Declaration, all the way through to the 692 Ecumenical Council, which of course some accept and some do not. But certainly the Chalcedonian Council, which articulates a clear Chalcedonian Christian faith expression to which churches are expected to adhere. And I'm not taking exception with those things specifically, but these are brought under the auspices of empire. So each of these councils are convoked under the auspices of empire, whether a coercive auspices or not could be argued, or might be of no import at all. But for an individual such as myself and others who come from a colonial experience of Christianity through things like the residential schools, any effort at calling together civil authority with ecclesial authority immediately evokes some suspicion. And so you might appreciate that for many of us in the Indigenous world, there is a suspicion, not about the content necessarily of creedal statements, etc., that emerge from the councils, which the councils are convoked, and the purposes for which they are initially called, and the expectation of a monocultural or monolithic expression of Christianity, no room for any kind of heterodoxy. And so as we continue to move forward, we see what happens oftentimes is an entrenching of a colonial kingdom mindset, where you will become as we are. You will be censured otherwise, or perhaps your life will be forfeit. So colonial Christianity emerges and pushes forward with an intertwined colonial journey, where conversion as often as not is by the sword of steel as by the sword of the spirit. And so we can see in the writings of people like Norman Cantor and Toyin Falola, Steve Evans, thank you, Stephen, for your continued contributions, Jean and John Komaroff, Rodney Stark, Richard Fletcher, et cetera, the idea of a mythic expression of Christianity as being a peaceful missional force, as opposed to something that actually, together with empire, pushes forward, often with a violent and aggressive posture. And at best, perhaps we see the idea of justification through the myth of upward lift. And I dare say that if we look at many contexts where mission has been prosecuted for centuries with the idea that it would produce upward lift, the continued sociocultural conflicts that exist in many of those contexts betray any sense in which that has been so. So then, as we move forward into the next generations of the church, we see the church engaging colonialism so fully that it begins to articulate these in legal principles, as at 1095 with Pope Urban II issuing the papal bull Terra Nullius, giving monarchies of Europe the right to discover or claim land in non-Christian areas. And here we see perhaps the fullest expression of the merger of church and state begin, where one becomes at times indistinguishable from the other. And the mission of one becomes even less distinguishable from the other at times. The New World on paper becomes legally vacant, or vacuum domicilium in the Latin. Terra Nullius essentially says that we give free and full permission to invade, search out. The long and short of it is to reduce persons in lands that are not immediately or presently under Christian dominion or under Christian auspices into things like perpetual slavery. And of course, that becomes the experience of so many people in the quote unquote New World, or the world being engaged, we use the word in quotes, discovered by European colonials. So the colonial church policy is expanded further as Terra Nullius is extended, with Nicholas issuing the papal bull Romanus Pontifex, declaring war against all non-Christians throughout the world, authorizing the conquest of nations and territories. And if we read theologians in the era, we see not simply a complicity, but an affirmation of these policies, such as these papal bulls would articulate, as a means of bringing into existence the kingdom of God in an earthly presence. And it's almost as if at times the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven," is a mandate to in fact bring that kingdom by whatever means are required. And so we see these kinds of policies impacting Indigenous communities. And so when we see these edicts treating non-Christians as uncivilized and subhuman, and therefore without rights to land or nation, but beyond that, a suspicion that they might not even be in possession of a soul at this juncture, we see this as a means of justification of war, colonization, and again, slavery. And so as we move to the era of Columbus, John and Sebastian Cabot, and all of the other explorers of Europe who set out to try and find something, often becoming lost in the process, which is where many of us in the North American context would make a little bit of a joke and poke a little bit of fun at, and say, when Christopher Columbus set out to find India and landed in the North, Central, and South Americas, we ask, what does it feel like, do you think, to be told that you were discovered by somebody who was lost? As certainly many of those who left Europe in these early years were. By the time Columbus and Cabot and others set sail in 1492, the Doctrine of Discovery, which is precisely what Soong-Chan Rah and Mark Charles' book, and a very nicely done book at that, articulates, is this notion somehow that lands outside of Europe are free for the taking because they are not under Christian dominion. Therefore, the cultures and the peoples of those cultures are either sub or inhuman or non-human, however you'd care to word it, and perhaps all three of those. It's this idea that allows policies to begin to emerge that are both engaged by church in mission, but also certainly by civil authorities that prosecute this policy of absorption or assimilation. And so the Doctrine of Discovery, what many of us in the Indigenous world simply refer to, because it was announced by various papacies, we simply proclaim it the Doctrine of Christian Theft, which seemed to legitimize theft of land and, in essence, theft of culture and personhood under the auspices of pursuing the establishment of earthly and heavenly kingdoms. And so by the time Columbus reaches America, he performs a ceremony to take possession of lands, quote, discovered. And that simply means all territory not occupied by or under the monarchy or jurisdiction of Christian monarchs. We find a robust retrenching of this idea in 1493 with Alexander VI, with the papal bull Interculturality, granting Spain the right to conquer the lands that Columbus had already discovered and all lands that it might come upon in the future. And while this might focus on a specific nation, Spain and Portugal as well, this quickly extends itself to other nations in Europe that engage in exploration, and through and complete with the quote unquote secular explorer, the Christian exploration and missionization process. So the decree expresses the Pope's wish to convert the natives of these lands to Catholicism in order to strengthen the Christian empire. There is as yet still an uncertainty in many of the proceedings that we read about in this era as to whether or not Indigenous people are in fact fully human and in possession of a soul so that they might be missioned and converted. And in fact, it is not until we get to Paul III in 1537 in Sublimis Deus where we actually get a full articulation that there is indeed a soul resident in these beings, these indigenous beings of other lands, and they are indeed human. Now, this doesn't necessarily change some of the mission policies, unfortunately, or some of the policies of exploration and colonization. They continue to be harshly prosecuted, harshly implemented, and the outcomes of them are horrendous and onerous. Colonial Christianity continues this intertwined colonial journey, and so we can bring it home whether we live in America, Canada, Africa, India, or Asia, or many other parts of the globe, and make it more specific and more particular to these contexts as an intertwining of church and state. And so, for example, I would articulate in the Canadian context the fact that in 1925, the United Church, and this is not a reflection on the people of this particular church or this denomination, but the United Church of Canada comes into existence by an act of Canadian Parliament. And in 2018, when it sought to change its articles, it brought those once again before the Canadian Parliament so that they might be transformed or changed. And there's a very clear sense in which one must question why in the world a particular denominational tradition would continue to find it necessary to be so associated with civil authority. And certainly it must move beyond the idea that we still live in some form of Christendom in the 2018 period. And of course, it would be foolish to not examine the Christian nationalism that has arisen in various parts of the globe, not least of which the United States of America over these past years, as a further expression of this idea that nation states and Christianity and Christian mission, whatever that might look like in people's thinking or whatever it might be expressed as, is deeply entrenched one with the other. And so this image that was part of the American colonial experience, the idea of the angelic figure going before the colonial advance, carrying in her right hand the scriptures, moving with the colonials and with the colonial expansion westward, and driving these indigenous savages before them, hopefully and preferably by many of the edicts of and acts of state and federal legislation to their extinction. In fact, in Canada in 1920, a similar statement was issued by Duncan Campbell Scott, then what we would call Minister of Indian Affairs, who said that in due course, the Indian problem would be rectified and distinctly disappear as Indigenous peoples were assimilated into the Canadian body politic, their cultures and ways eradicated, and they themselves ceased to be in existence as a distinct people. And it's this kind of idea of manifest destiny, which is hand in hand with the idea of doctrine of discovery and mission that we experience. So the old theology is built on a theology of deficiency and deficit. And these papal bulls, the ideas of terra nullius, the idea of manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, and the fact that the church does not critique them nor resist them, but in fact sees them as being in service to them to prosecute their understanding of or their particular way of mission by again, assimilating peoples and their lands, moves the idea of civilization and Christianization as the twin efforts of state and church forward. It's built on the idea that there is a distinct deficiency in culture and personhood of the other, a distinct deficiency even in the land, as we find with the Jesuits in early mission here in North America among my people in the early 1600s, describing the very lands of Mi'kmaq, the lands of my ancestors, as lands that Satan himself had forsaken. And this idea of deficit and deficiency is deeply entrenched with the mission impulse, and I would argue from not very long after the Jerusalem Council, certainly within 100 years, where the notion is that other people must become like us in order for them to be fully and truly Christian. And then as the councils move forward and other articulations from church officials as well as civil authority merge together, we see this deficiency being entrenched as a justification for mission. In fact, you could look at the Edinburgh 1910 Mission Conference and find the idea of civilization and Christianization embedded in the discussions and outputs of the 1910 Mission Conference in my reading of it. And certainly as I presented at the 2010 anniversary of the Edinburgh Conference, you could still hear the echoes of it in many of the sessions at that time. The old pedagogy was the idea that there I learn, there meaning the mission context, the church context, the civil context, there we as Indigenous people or the other learn someone else's language, culture, and history as if our own does not exist. And it looks at, in an ecclesial eschatological way as one of these kinds of diagrams, this being only one of many that we could put forward, where there's a linear trajectory from past through the present toward the future, driven by the idea of the kingdom to come, which I'm not debating, but the idea of the kingdom to come, meaning our present engagement must require a particular transformative experience that is represented in our cultural ways and norms, that replaces the cultural ways and norms of all others. And of course, if one follows this trajectory backward into history as Western people think of time, one finds the Hebraic narrative leading into the early New Testament, the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, the entrenchment of the gospel as central to the mission of the church, the gospel call being taken up, migrating into Europe, moving from east to west, taking a European flavor with it, and European culture and civilization becoming intertwined with the gospel call in such a way as the two become all but indistinguishable many times. And it is this reduction of culture into a singular monolithic expression of what it means to be Christian vis-a-vis European cultural forms and norms that we find so difficult to swallow. In a Indigenous pedagogy, we look at decolonizing theology and missiology and certainly eschatology in an educational, spiritual, and material way, so that it's rooted in Indigenous histories, contexts, and ontologies. And we find authors like Richard Twist, Wendy Peterson, Randy Woodley, Casey Church, and many others in this new wave of Indigenous scholars articulating these ways of thought. And so we find then a circular way of thinking, and you can affirm that I am an Indigenous person because I like circles, not lines. We move from creator through the creation, the context in which different people groups find themselves, the establishment of community and norms of community, the development of culture and cultural ways and understandings, worldviews, if you will, although certainly more to it than that, rooted in epistemologies that are certainly many times different, that lead to ceremony as a means of seeking after, reaching out for, if perhaps they might take hold of God, as per Paul's expression in Acts 17. And the question mark becoming, how does one bring these things together? And so as my ancestor, Gitchagama Membertu, was baptized on June 24th, 1610, just down the coast from where I currently live, his articulation in our oral tradition that my cousins and I and our other family members carry is that he not only confirmed his allegiance to the French, but he talked about the gospel as a teaching that carries us in the direction that we were already going, but allows us to arrive at a place we could not see. And it's that kind of thing, that this cyclical way, moving forward through multiple cultures, allows for, that is not imposing a cultural way of thinking, but allowing for the cultures and peoples with whom the gospel engages to bring forward unique expressions. And we have an iterative and formative way to see mission moving forward. And so asset-based theology and missiology as a framework for change, in comparing approaches moving from deficit and asset-based, a deficit-based missiology and theology starts with the problem of the fall, focuses on the implications of the collapse of creation, particularly humanity. An asset-based approach, on the other hand, appreciates and projects a path forward from the Creator's intent for balance, harmony, shalom, and the wholeness of creation. The outcome in a deficit-based has led and still leads, and we can see that in Christian nationalism, leads to a dehumanizing of others, that they must become like us in order for them to be authentically Christian and American and whatever. And then, of course, in an asset-based approach, this could lead us to an appreciation for the image and likeness of God in all humanity. And so if we stop to think about the fact that there is but one human spirituality, not many, that all are created in the image and likeness of God and therefore in possession of the same human spirituality, we find that then we're not discussing whether one's spirituality is okay or not. We're discussing the expression of that spirituality in religious trajectories, traditions, ideologies, etc., and whether or not there's efficacy in those, whether they lead to a place where there is an effective experience of wholeness and fulfillment. That's a different experience than what we have had in the past, where other, quote, spiritualities are seen as deficient or defective or inadequate. The framework then becomes, in a Eurocentric or Indigenous context, deficit and deficiency-based versus asset and affirmation-based, beginning with the fall. Implications of that frame the theology and therefore the mission theology and therefore the missiology. In an Indigenous context, it begins with the creator-creation intention and the relationship thereof. There's a conventional disregard for other than humanity in a Eurocentric approach. And except for the last several decades, we could say that an anthropocentric view of salvation and eschatology is clearly entrenched in virtually all traditions of the church. Whereas in an Indigenous frame, there's a focus on an interconnected creation. We are interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent. And as Paul would make known in Romans 8, the creation itself awaits the revelation of the sons, and I will add daughters of God, and the creation itself groans in travail, awaiting its own redemption, even as human beings do. So relationships and harmony are at the focus and forefront of an Indigenous understanding of theology and missiology. Sin is defined in terms of legal and moral transgression in a Eurocentric way, and that clearly situates Indigenous people as being legally and morally culpable in ways that Europeans are not necessarily. And sin in our context is defined in terms of broken relationships and broken covenants, which looks very different in its outcome. And so an asset-based theology and missiology focuses on the restoration of three spheres of relationship: right relationship with the Creator and with other spiritual powers, right relationship with one another in the human community, and right relationship and right relatedness to the rest of the creation, of which humanity is but a part. And so this leads us to moving away from a deficit-based to an asset-based expression of theology and mission, and therefore embraces interculturality, not simply multicultural frames, but interculturality that is inclusive of all creation as the focus of God's redemptive activity in Christ. It's not voyeuristic in terms of multicultural cuteness. It's not simply tolerating the other, but rather saying, what does the other bring that helps to complete and fulfill who I am as part of God's created order? It's not framed first and foremost by a set of legal and moral codes, but is concerned with relationship and relatedness. Sin is therefore the breach of relationship and relatedness, and mission therefore is about relational healing. God and other spiritual powers, humanity in right relationship and right relatedness with creation. Welalin, welaliak. Thank you very much.